Greetings viewers, it's me, EricTheCarGuy. Thanks for tuning in today. Today I'm going to be performing a quote-unquote major service on my 2008 TL, which pretty much involves replacing the filters, the fluids, the spark plugs. This is more the major service. As far as the spark plugs, those get replaced every 105,000 miles or so. I'm also throwing in a couple of extra things. I noticed when I removed my radiator cap that it looked like this. There's supposed to be another valve that's on here that I sometimes see this go away. So I just replaced this with one that I had. This is the radiator cap that I had lying around, and they're supposed to look like this underneath. You see that valve was missing from that previous radiator cap. In addition to that, somebody replaced the battery cables, which you might have seen during the inspection video, so I'm going to replace them with these, or just the positive one with this. I'm covering the cabin air filter replacement in a separate video. I'll go over it here. I'm also going to be replacing the timing belt and water pump, which I will also be covering specifically in another video. But pretty much, this would be a smackdown on a 2008 TL, which is like 2004 through 2008 TL. Also very similar to a V6 Accord. I'm just putting regular 5W20 engine oil in this time. I'm not doing any kind of synthetic, but I might consider, well, actually I would consider putting high mileage oil in this engine since it has almost 200,000 miles on it. As far as the transmission fluid, I'm using Honda automatic transmission fluid, which is the only transmission fluid I recommend for Hondas. I'm also going to be using the Honda Blue Coolant for this service, as well as a Honda oil filter. These NGK laser iridium spark plugs are the original equipment spark plugs. You need 6 of them. When doing a major service like this, it's also a good idea to replace the wiper blades. I usually like to replace them in the spring and the fall anyway. I ended up replacing these after the windshield was replaced. While you're at it, it's also a good idea to check all of your lights and turn signals to make sure that everything is working properly. Job 1 is going to be to remove some engine covers to gain access. I'm not going to cover the removal of these plastic covers in detail in this video. I actually covered that in the O2 sensor replacement video, so if you want detail on that, I'll link that down in the description. Otherwise, it's just a matter of being careful when removing things so that you don't break them. I'm also not covering the detail of a removal of this upper strut brace in this video. That is also covered in the O2 sensor video, which once again I'll link in the description. I like to combine steps when I'm doing my service. Now, if you're working at home with a floor jack and jack stands, you would probably start by lifting up the front and the back and getting it off the ground and lowering it down on jack stands. I'm just doing the same thing here with a lift. But what I'll start with is I'll start draining the fluid, starting with the oil. Since we also have to drain the transmission fluid, there's a splash shield here that needs to come down. But while the oil is draining, my plan is to take the wheels off. I would also check the tire pressures. And if you're doing a tire rotation, rotate the tires and we can service the brakes, although I'm replacing the brakes on this car. You'll need a 17 millimeter. Hopefully it's 17. Hopefully it hasn't been to a quick lube place and it's now something else. 17 it is. Want to make sure I got that washer with it. I'm also going to knock the oil filter loose so that, oh well, I'm going to need a wrench for it so that that can also drain. Once you take the wheel off, the next thing you want to do is remove this inner cover, which kind of goes across the front here. You really only need to like pull it past half of it, but in other words, you only need to disconnect it down to about here and then you can roll it back up underneath. I'll show you that now. And I use this tool for removing the plastic clips. It sort of pinches and pulls them out. I'll show you when I get the chance to see one up close. Here's when you can actually see. It squeezes and pulls it through, so you've just got to pull it up a little bit. There's also clips here, another one back here. A little bit of WD-40 on these helps these come apart a little bit easier. But that's all I should need to take out. Now you can just sort of pull this down and move it out of the way. Like this, and I'll just take a bungee cord, hook it in here. You do not need to remove the lower splash shield in order to drain the coolant on this vehicle. I did it because in addition to the major service, I was also doing a timing belt and water pump and replacing the inner fender liners on both sides. So for me, it made sense to do it. But if all you're doing is a service and draining and refilling the coolant, you don't need to remove the splash shield in order to do that. there's some gunk on the front of this engine, and I'm just going to try to clean it up before I start taking things apart, so that way when I take things apart I don't introduce dirt into places I don't want it to be. Going to install the oil filter now. Take a little bit of the old oil, put it on the seal. Make sure you don't double gasket. That has happened to me before. Like, make sure there's no oil. Make sure there's no oil filter gasket still present here. Gonna reinstall my drain plug with a new crust washer. To get this shield down, there are plastic clips sort of ringing the perimeter, and then there's a 10mm fastener here and one up in here. It's just so much easier to remove this than it is to try and I'm using this tool. I'll link it in the description to get these clips out. If they give you trouble, hit them with a little WD-40 and they come out a little easier. These are 10mm fasteners, if I didn't mention that already. Yeah, there's a transmission. It's hard to say exactly what this is. I normally start with oil leaks up towards the top, so I wouldn't immediately assume that this is a rear main seal leak in here, because this is the engine and this is the transmission. This is where they mate. That seal would be up underneath here. Even so, at almost 200,000 miles, this could just be that amount of seepage. It's hard to say. I don't think this car was serviced very regularly, so I'm going to come in, clean everything off, and then I'll monitor stuff. So in other words, if I start to see leaks in here, then I'll be concerned. But otherwise I'll just leave it be, because to do the rear main seal means removing the transmission. I'm not inclined to do that at this time. All right, so this is the area after I've quote unquote cleaned it. I didn't do a stellar job on it. I'm really just trying to keep the areas like around here clear of any, well, to make it dry. And if it starts to get wet, and depending upon how long it takes to get there, I can gauge how severe that leak is or isn't. It's been about a month and a half, 2 months since I shot the footage you just saw of me cleaning this area. And as you can see, a little bit of oil has returned. I believe this is likely from a rear main seal leak. I did replace the valve cover gaskets. Like I've mentioned, I like to start with oil leaks up high first and work my way down. This doesn't look severe enough for me to warrant removing the transmission and replacing the seal just yet. But I'm pointing this out to basically illustrate that during a service, you want to look out for problems like this, or leaks, any kind of leaks, not just oil leaks, coolant leaks, so that you can keep an eye on them. This is the idea of maintenance, so that you can keep an eye on issues like this before they become real problems. That's the entire reason that you want to service and observe what's going on with your vehicle. So I'm just pointing this out so that you have an idea of what to look for and perhaps how to go about addressing leaks like this one. Transmission drain plug is located here. You just need a 3/8 ratchet to go in. The drain plug has a magnet on it. It's normal to have stuff on here. So don't be thinking if you've got stuff on here, it's bad, but that's normal to see that. In fact, with this engine and transmission and apparent lack of maintenance, I would have expected to see more. So that's not as bad as I thought it would be. I'm going to be replacing these inner fender liners, as I've mentioned, on both sides. So I'm just going to take this whole front splash shield down. It's just, you just find the clips and undo them like I showed you on the other ones. Once it starts to get to the point where it's dripping, reinstall the drain plug. You can reuse this crush washer a few times. I wouldn't sweat it too much. In fact, I don't think it was leaking. But you don't need to over torque. Just snug it up. There's nothing else over on this side of the vehicle that really needs to be addressed. Therefore, I'm just going to put my cover back up in there. One of the main things whenever you're doing any kind of service is to really look the vehicle over. Look at all the compliance bushings, check for any loose suspension parts like ball joints or tie rods or things like that. Shake the wheels before you remove them. I did this during my initial inspection of this vehicle, so I knew what I was up against. Also check the tires for any issues as far as tire pressures or any abnormal wear, that type of thing, which could indicate an alignment issue. Basically, take the opportunity with the service to truly look the vehicle over and see if there are any problems that are happening now or may potentially happen in the future. Normally during the course of a major service, I will clean and lubricate the brakes. However, the brakes on this car, both front and rear, were worn out and required replacement. BuyAutoParts.com was kind enough to send me these rotors and pads. Yes, they are drilled and slotted rotors. I didn't necessarily ask for these, but I didn't complain about them either. Do they help the car stop any better? I don't think so, but the car stops absolutely great, and I'm very happy with the result. Before I forget, I'm going to add transmission fluid. To do that, right here down on the top of the transmission is that 17 millimeter plug that you need to remove, and I install a funnel and put the transmission fluid in there. Sometimes it's on there surprisingly snug, so I come prepared with a breaker bar. And I'm glad I did. There's no separate differential on these, so all you need to worry about is the transmission fluid. Normally I wouldn't be able to move this fuse box out of the way and I use a longer funnel, but with the cross brace removed, it's actually quite easy to move it out of the way. And I'm putting in 3 fresh quarts of Honda ATF. After driving the car around for about a week, I rechecked the transmission fluid level and found it to be about a ½ quart low. And I'm finding this to be somewhat typical on later model Honda transmissions. So instead of just 3 quarts, you might consider getting 4 quarts just in case you need that extra ½ quart. If you want to change your fluid, I recommend changing it 3 times. So change it once, then drive it for a little bit, maybe 100 miles or so or something like that. Change it again, then drive it, well, maybe 100 miles is too much, maybe like 20 miles, and then change it again. So 3 of these fluid changes would equate to like changing all of the fluid, because you're never going to get everything out of the torque converter and everything else. But if you're really animate about that, and in my experience, if you do this every 30,000 miles or so, just changing out with 3 quarts of Honda ATF, there's usually isn't an issue. Now I realize TLs of an older vintage had a bad reputation for transmission problems. These not so much. By the time they made these, they had most of those issues pretty well sorted out. Now if you have one of these with a 6-speed manual transmission, obviously this procedure is going to be different, but I recommend using Honda manual transmission fluid when you do that. Or I've also had success with GM Synchromesh manual transmission fluid as well in the Hondas. Those are the only 2 things that I would use. But definitely in the automatics, only Honda ATF. I know it's expensive, but transmissions are more expensive. This doesn't need to be like super tight. Just snug it up. That's all it needs. It's not going to come flying off of there. With the transmission fluid changed, I'm now going to turn my attention to the spark plugs, which aren't all that difficult. The rear ones are more difficult, but without this strut brace, it's actually quite simple. I'll show you on the front pretty much what you need to do. It's just a matter of unplugging the coil packs. There's a little tab here you need to depress. And then remove these 10 millimeter nuts, and you can remove the coil packs. Underneath those coil packs is the spark plugs. Be super careful around this dipstick because it's plastic and you can break it off. So if you're concerned about that, remove it all together and set it aside until you're done servicing. When you break this off down inside here, trust me, it's a lot of fun trying to get it out if it breaks off flush. Don't ask me how I know. And then as you're removing the coil packs, inspect to see if there's any oil on them at all. If there is, then you've got a oil seal that needs to be replaced. That's interesting. Yeah, so yeah, there's a little bit of oil down in that one, which sucks. I'm going to leave this for another day when I do, say, a valve adjustment, because in order to replace the seal, you need to remove the valve cover and everything else. And if I'm going to be in there doing that, I might as well commit to a valve adjustment. For now, I'm going to replace the plugs. I don't think that this is a lot of oil. I don't consider it to be a lot of oil, but that's what you want to look for. You want to look for if you see stuff like that, because if you do, well, then you need to replace the seals in the valve cover in order to deal with that. Put the coil packs out of the way, remove the plugs. Oh yeah, I'd say that it's been a while since he's been replaced. But it's burning good. It's a nice clean porcelain that I see there. Oh, it might be burning a little bit of oil. You see it's a little bit tan. And no, it's not burning oil from what's getting into the spark plug well. This is inside the combustion chamber. This is outside. Yeah, another one that looks like it's burning just fine. So despite appearances and mileage, it's actually not doing too bad. I'm gonna put a little brake clean down in those holes to wash some of the oil out. You don't want to load it up because it'll evaporate. But if you get a bunch of liquid down inside the cylinder and you try to start it, bad things will happen. Bad things will happen. And also, believe me when I say, that is not a lot of oil. Now, as far as plug gap, don't touch it. Because my experience with these NGKs, unless the package is somehow damaged or something like that, that these don't require any gapping at all. Just install them in the cylinder head. Sometimes what I do is I'll take a little drop of engine oil and just put it on the threads. No anti-seize, just maybe a little drop of engine oil, that's it. And also important not to let it just bang down into the inside there, because that could actually bend the electrode. So be mindful of that. You really only need to go until they're snug. So maybe about a half turn and then some. Yeah, that's a half. All right, 3/4 of a turn past the time they're snug. Dry this off before I put it down in there, because brake fluid is very flammable in vapor form. And when you start adding spark to flammable things, well, that's what makes the engine run. But you want to keep that on the inside, not the outside. Explosions on the inside. Use 1/4-inch tools for this so you don't over tighten. Because really, these things aren't going to come blowing out of here. Now we can do the ones in the back. What?
Because if you want to show the passage of time,
you gotta have a montage. Nope, not gonna do a montage this time, but I like the way cameraman Brian thinks. We like to keep things light while working in the shop making these videos for you. No oil on that one. No oil on that one. And no oil on that one. I use, I think that's like a 6-inch extension. But I have to drop the socket in first and then add the extension because I don't have enough room under here. Once again, looks like it's burning good. Truthfully, these plugs back here don't look that old at all. It's weird because normally the front ones would be new and the rear ones would be old because they didn't bother changing them, is kind of what I'm getting at. But it's interesting how these back plugs all look relatively new. Oh, and an FYI, if you open it, like the picture on the box, you'll get the top here. If you open the bottom, you'll get that part. Never check gaps on these, and I have no idea how many of these I've installed in 20-some years. The only time I ever had a problem was when they were down inside a well like this, and I just dropped them in really quick. I was in a hurry, and one of the electrodes bent, and it created a misfire after doing a tune-up. That was the only time I ever had an issue, and that was something I caused. And I almost think going through and gapping these, you can cause a problem because of the coating that was on the end of this electrode. You could wear it off by doing that. Point is I've never done it, and it hasn't been an issue other than what I just mentioned. But hey, it's your vehicle. Do what you want. One thing I've done a lot of on these cars is replace the high pressure power steering hose. There was a recall on those. I did so many of those. In fact, that's why I have so much Honda power steering fluid. Because with every one of those kits I had to replace, which by the way, this thing runs under the engine mount back here. So yeah, that was challenging. And the whole job I think paid 7/10, which is a little more than a half an hour. And yeah, you had to undo an engine mount. Welcome to the wonderful world of being an auto repair technician, kids. The real upside to it is working on your own stuff and not having to make vehicle payments. You can buy $200 vehicles like this and invest a couple grand like I'm doing here. And by the time you're done on the other side, and most of that's in tires, by the way, and by the time you're done and on the other side of it, you've got a reliable something that you can have cheap insurance on, that you maintain yourself. That's a beautiful thing. So you can save a lot of money by doing your own auto repair. And the reason I say professional mechanic is because you get the chance to write off your tools, whereas you don't get to do that as a DIYer necessarily. And that's that. Now I'll do the air filter. It's held in by 4 8mm or Phillips head screws. I don't trust the Phillips head screws, so I'm just using an 8mm. It's ready. Some leaves down in here. I feel better about that. Something else I like to do during a major service like this, which I didn't mention at the beginning, is change the brake fluid. I turkey baster it out of the master cylinder. Now, in addition to doing that, I also plan on putting steel braided brake lines on this in the not too distant future, so I'll bleed the rest of the system out that way. It is, I would say, considered acceptable just to turkey baste the fluid that's in the master cylinder out and then start over with fresh fluid. And if you do bleed it out, the wheel's great. But I've often done this at services, and I would say getting most of the fluid out instead of none of the fluid out during a service is better. Better. And if that's dirty, I clean it out with brake cleaner, but it looks pretty good actually. I know I got a fancy metal turkey baster, and the reason I have a fancy metal turkey baster is because my plastic ones kept going, ugh. So this was like, I don't know, an $8 turkey baster, which is ridiculous, but I hope it's the last turkey baster I ever buy for this kind of thing. And avoid getting this on paint because it will ruin the finish. Maybe I can get down in there a little more with my stabby part. Yeah, this one's got a stabby part. Oh yeah, I can totally get down in there. This is the best darn turkey baster I've ever had for this. I think that's about as far as I'm gonna get. But that was a lot. This system takes .3 or .4 fluid. I'm using .3. And I'm actually going to be replacing the front brakes, so I'm going to wait until I'm done doing that before I completely top it off. I had to clean the outside of the reservoir. It's easier to tell how much fluid is in it. And now let's address that battery terminal issue that I found during the initial inspection of this car when I got it. To undo this old junk. This is going to be my new terminal, and yeah, I was afraid of that. I need to make these slightly larger. Once I do, life will be good. Now, even though this is brand new and brass, I'm still going to rough up the surface on the inside because a little bit of oxidation can happen. And I'm trying to get the best electrical connection possible. Okay. By the way, the negative is not connected, so there's no path to ground. I'm not worried about making a spark by touching this. Now that is a good electrical connection. Oops, forgot that this has got to go in first.
Now that's a good electrical connection.
Now that is a good electrical connection with the battery cover. And now the hold down. Avoid running this down so much it distorts the battery case. That's bad. Just need to snug it up. And finally, I already cleaned the top of the battery, but keep your batteries clean because, believe it or not, voltage can bleed out through the dirt. Video link in the description about that. Now, when these things, well, older Hondas, when they came in from the factory, brand new, all Honda would do was take a little bit of grease and put it on the positive terminal. That's all they would do, and the negative terminal. But this is how they prevented corrosion, let's say. Now, as that heats up, it'll eventually seep into everything and hopefully not disturb my electrical connection, which I don't believe it will, but that's how they came from the factory. When doing a service, I also like to change out the coolant. Now, once you get the lower splash shield off, the petcock for the radiator is right here, and it should drain through this hole. Just turn it counterclockwise, if you can. Kind of hard to get up in there. And once you get it draining, I'm gonna lower this down. You take the radiator cap off, it'll come out even faster. Earlier in this video, I mentioned rotating and inspecting your tires during a major service. During my initial inspection of this vehicle, I found some of the tires to be completely worn out. In fact, so much so that the cords were showing. So I decided to replace all 4 tires with a set of Michelin Pilot Sport AS's. I feel that these are the best tires for this vehicle. That's just my personal opinion after working on these cars for years and years. That said, I do have one complaint about these tires, and that is when it's cold, sometimes there's a vibration until the tires warm up. To me, this is a moderate concern, not really something to be too worried about, but something I feel that's worth mentioning. Now, something else that some people brought up in the comments of my initial inspection video was a lot of that tire wear seemed to be on the inside edge of the tire, and that is an excellent eye, and that's the kind of thing that I want you looking out for during the course of this service to possibly indicate an alignment issue. And anytime you do get new tires, it is recommended that you also get an alignment. But in my experience, this inside tire wear is typical on Honda vehicles, especially if they're not running Michelin tires. I know that sounds weird, but it's just something I've noticed over time. Now, the last thing I'll mention is that when installing new tires on aluminum wheels, I've gotten into the practice of cleaning the wheels before installing the new tires, and I do this to prevent any leaks at the bead. I have seen some cases where the aluminum wheels will corrode and cause a leak where the bead meets the wheel. In order to prevent this, I like to clean the wheels before installing new tires. So if you've recently had tires installed on aluminum wheels and you've got a slow leak, it might be a good idea to check to see if there's a leak around the rims. And I do this by spraying a little bit of soapy water around the rim where it meets the tire. And if you see bubbles coming out, then you've found a leak and you should take it back to wherever you got those tires installed. And I would make a point of asking them not to go in and just put bead sealer in there, but actually going in and cleaning up the wheels. Now, I probably pissed off some tire shops by saying that, but I just find that a better way to address the problem other than gooping it up with a bunch of stuff that somebody has to deal with later down the road when they change tires. One more thing I'll share with you about tires. In addition to the all seasons, I also got myself a set of winter wheels and tires for the TL. These are Nokian Hakkapeliitta R3s, and these, in my opinion, are excellent winter tires. I know this for a fact because I've actually driven on these tires in the Arctic Circle, and I can say they have plenty of grip on snow and ice. But one thing to note is that these wheels are actually smaller than what's on their stock. What's on their stock is 17-inch. These are actually 16-inch wheels, which gives me a little bit more sidewall for better grip. Also, these are a little bit narrower. I find that narrower tires tend to cut through the snow and have better traction than wider tires, which tend to skate up on top of them. These are just my opinions. But these are the tires and wheels that I got for when it gets snowy and icy outside, and all I have to do is take off the other ones and bolt these on. All right, we're down to just a little drip, so I can close this up. You don't need to crank this down with pliers or anything. You just need to snug it up with your fingers and that should be fine. As previously stated, I am not going with any kind of quote-unquote special oil. I'm just going to go with conventional of the correct viscosity, which according to the oil cap is 5W20. I don't know what was in this previously. I have this conventional oil in stock and I'm just going to use what I have. And in case you were curious, this engine takes 5 quarts. Now I could put a little bit of oil in the oil filter when I installed it. That's not a bad idea. Not 100% necessary, but it does help when you first start the engine as far as getting oil to all the inner parts of the engine when you first start it up. That was messy and uncalled for. Why? Now it's everywhere. All over my pants. Pro tip, make sure your funnel is securely installed in the engine before you start dumping oil in. Where were we? Ah, yes, quart number 2 of 5. And just as an FYI, if you're concerned about me just putting conventional oil in this engine, when working at the dealership, all we used was bulk oil, unless the engine, like with an RDX initially when those came out, they called for Mobil 1. But if they don't call for quote-unquote synthetic oil, we just use conventional oil, and that was at the dealership. Namely because of the expense. It's much cheaper to buy conventional oil in bulk. And as much as I hate to say this, and it's probably changed now, when other oils like 5W20 started being used in the engines, we kept using the 5W30 stuff for quite some time in the engines, unbeknownst to many owners. So when you're getting your vehicle serviced, if you're really particular about the type of oil that goes into it, I suggest doing it yourself. You could bring the oil you want used in your engine to whatever place you're having it serviced. That is also an option. But I personally have never had issues with just using conventional oil. You know, I think the real important thing is that you make sure you put it in there, because it is important. Engines don't like to run without oil. In fact, they don't run for very long, in my experience. Next, let's get some coolant in here. It had green. Somebody changed it out for green coolant at some point. And I haven't known that to be like a real issue, adding green coolant to a system that originally took blue. I haven't seen real issues with that. But considering the options you have out there, like universal type coolants, they even Like some companies even make a specific colored coolant that's supposed to be universal for vehicles with that color coolant. Originally what was in this, and I have some, is the Honda blue coolant. This stuff, which is what I'm going to be running. And I'll put a link in the description to this. I've also got a video about how to bleed the air out of the cooling system. But since we did the water pump and drained the radiator, we should get most of the old green coolant out. But one thing I did notice when Honda switched from green to blue coolant was before the blue coolant, there were a lot of Honda radiator failures, and usually it was at the seam between the aluminum and the plastic tank. Since they switched to blue coolant, I don't really see that as much anymore, so the low phosphate formula or whatever they're using here seems to be working. And while you're filling, it's a good idea periodically just to check for leaks. So if you're pouring it in and you hear it dripping out on the floor, find out where that's coming from. It's probably important. I think all you'll need is 2 gallons. I'm also going to top up the overflow. Don't forget the bug juice. Before I start it up for the first time, I'm just going to take one last look underneath for any leaks or anything that might indicate that there's a problem. I don't see anything. I think we're good to go. Now, I realize some of you are going to be disappointed that there's no initial startup of this car after completing all this work in this video, and I apologize for that. But the reason is because in addition to doing the major service, I also did the timing belt and water pump. I also replaced the power steering pump, the thermostat, and the valve cover gaskets, all of which will be covered in other videos. So in one of those videos, you'll see that initial startup of the car after doing all this work. And once again, I apologize for not having that for you here today. But I do want to say that after you're done doing all this work and you're topping up all the coolant in particular, you want to make sure to bleed the air from the cooling system. Now, I'll link a video in the description that I did that covers this in detail. And also I cover it in one of those later videos that I mentioned, but you want to make sure you bleed the cooling system out. You want to make sure you check for leaks, and you want to be sure to continue to monitor things, particularly things that were of note that you found during your inspections when you were doing the service. We can't forget about resetting the all-important maintenance light, because that's going to be on. So turn the ignition switch on, and it says that the B13 service is due now. In order to reset that, there is down on the steering wheel the select reset light. Hold that down. And it switches over to maintenance reset, up to cancel, or select to OK. Press select again. And that should reset it. Let's do the key again. Everything's all reset. And that will conclude my coverage of the major service on a 2004 through 2008 Acura TL. This information will also apply to Honda Accords of the same vintage with the J Series V6. In fact, it could be said that the information I covered in this video can pretty much cover Hondas with a J Series V6 as far as major service is concerned. As I mentioned, I'm also going to be producing videos about the timing belt water pump replacement, power steering pump, thermostat, valve cover gaskets, also the cabin air filters, I mentioned those, and a few other things that I can't quite think of at the moment. This is basically part of a series that I'm doing on this car that I bought for $200, taking it from a $200 car to something I'm driving every day and relying on. There's a whole series that is going to be produced from this. Links to those down in the description. In fact, you'll notice at the top of the description there's a link to the previous video and the next video as far as when it becomes available. Also linked in the description will be any parts or tools, so if you have questions about anything you saw in this video, please check the description. The information is likely there. If you have automotive questions not covered in this video, I ask you head to EricTheCarGuy.com, also linked in the description. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share this video with the world. Really appreciate it when you do that stuff. Thank you. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.